Hi guys, this is Taylor and I'm here today with my April wrap-up. April was the definitive end to my lucky streak in terms of new releases, I think. I read a handful of new releases this month and I was just not feeling them. Also, looking back on it now, I think that this was kind of one of my signature months where I read so many wildly different types of books, and it's just kind of funny looking back at the disparity of them all. But without further ado, let's get into it. The first book I tackled in April was the prettiest book of the year so far, aka The Female Persuasion by Meg Wolitzer. This came out on the 3rd of April, so I started out the month just ready to dive into this. In this book we have our main character Greer Kadetsky, who in the beginning of the book is a freshman in college, and after an incident involving sexual assault at her college, she ends up meeting an older woman named Faith Frank, who ends up really putting her on the path to feminism and women's rights. This book also traces Greer's relationship with her long-term boyfriend as these new ideas kind of start to shape her brain in a different way. And I ended up having a pretty tepid relationship with this book. There was plenty to like and plenty to dislike. This was my first Wolitzer, and the first thing I noticed was that her strength is really her attention to realism and detail. Her characters and the situations that they were in all seemed very fleshed out and very genuine. I didn't particularly like any of the characters too much, but that's fine, I don't have to. And I also thought that the different themes explored in this book, especially the ones about different waves of feminism and different schools of thought, were mostly very aware, but I also don't think that they were anything particularly new. I did read a review, however, and I have to give credit here because this review put into words something that had been bothering me about this book, but that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Much of the book takes place around a set piece of privileged women gathering, paying a ridiculous ticket price, listening to women deliver inspirational messages with manicure stations and fancy food all around. The book knows that this is not a good look, and yet I often felt like I was at an event like this while reading this book. It's all very nice, but none of it feels real. And I know you're not here for someone else's review, but reading that was such a light bulb moment for me because that is exactly what the essence of this book felt like, and exactly the aspect that ended up rubbing me the wrong way. I gave The Female Persuasion 3 stars, but it's still the prettiest book of the year, not sorry. The second book I read in April also came out on the 3rd, and it was Lawn Boy by Jonathan Evison. Lawn Boy. In this novel, our main character is Mike Munoz. He is half white, half Mexican, and he has just quit his job as a landscaper and is just generally pursuing a greater purpose for his life. A strength of this book was its tackling of things like poverty, class struggles, identity, things like that. It really did do a great job of making those issues accessible and understandable. However, and I have to say, I really wanted to love this book, which is even worse than going in and just having high expectations, because the whole time I was just rooting for this book to do better. Basically, our main character Mike is so lovable. He's such a good character and he deserves a decent plotline, and this book had no plotline to speak of. It was very readable. It was a relatively enjoyable reading experience, but the plot was so lurching and then non-existent, and then there's something that happens at the very end to try and kind of tie things up that feels so forced and tired and just out of place. I had so many questions. It's hard because this novel did a lot of things really well. It's kind of playfully rough around the edges, but it tackles real issues. But in the end, I just think it was poorly executed, and in the end, I really wanted more for poor Mike. I ended up giving this 2 stars on Goodreads, and I felt awful about it. But on an interesting note, when I did go to rate this on Goodreads, the first 5 or 6 reviews were all glowing 5-star reviews, and as of now, this has a relatively high rating on Goodreads, so maybe I don't know what I'm talking about and maybe you'll love it. At this point in the month is when I told myself that I would finally read The Country of Ice Cream Star, which is one of the 10 books that I challenged myself to read this year, and basically I just decided once and for all that this is not gonna happen, and I ended up DNFing it. This is a post-apocalyptic novel where much of the population has died of a pandemic. The virus still remains, but it only affects you if you're in your late teens or later. So this means that the world is now exclusively populated by teenagers and young children. As a result, the English language has kind of morphed into a different dialect, and the book itself is written in that dialect. I want to say on the record that I love the concept of this book, and I think it's such a huge accomplishment to write an entire novel, and a very large one at that, in a brand new dialect, and to also make it like intelligible. And the writing has some surprisingly beautiful moments. I remember the main character once referring to something as bad, like a no-luck sky. However, I am just too intimidated by this to allow myself to fully enjoy the book. Reading this novel with its language structure just takes double the time of a regular book, and it's one of those books that kind of just drops you in with no information and you have to orient yourself. And all that combined with the length of the book just made me realize that this is not really going to happen, and I think I'm mostly at peace with that. So right now is when we switch genres very suddenly, because the next book that I read was Boston Marriages, Romantic but Asexual Relationships Among Contemporary Lesbians by Esther D. Rothblum and Kathleen A. Brehony. And this is exactly what it says. It is nonfiction focusing on many different couples and the setups of their relationships. I think I said in a recent video that I used to study relationship structures, and this definitely falls into the category of things that I'm interested in. And I liked this book. I think it is very important to note that it was released in the early 90s, and a lot of these concepts were very new and very radical, just like unheard of at the time, or at least just not talked about openly. And as a result, we occasionally do encounter some quite outdated opinions and points. Overall, it definitely did give me some things to think about, and I did enjoy the reading experience. My main critique would have to be that although it follows many couples, kind of surprisingly few of them actually meet the criteria of romantic but asexual. Like, a lot of them were close but no cigar, so that was kind of weird. But like I said, I enjoyed this for the most part. There is an especially heartening chapter by a sex therapist who actually read this book as a manuscript and then wrote an essay to be included in the book explaining how reading the manuscript had kind of changed her whole conception of sexuality and healthy relationships. And so I'd like to think that even though it has some problematic aspects, this book maybe helped some people back in the 90s. I ended up giving this 3 stars, and I'm glad I read it. Again, switching genres very abruptly, the next thing I picked up in April was Volume 1 of a children's graphic novel series. This is called Sci-fu, and it's by Yehudi Mercado. The story behind this is that I was unpacking this from one of our orders at the library, and I started leafing through it, and I just fell in love with the art style. It's so colorful and bright. I just immediately set it aside. This is set in the 80s in Brooklyn and follows our main character Wax, who is dreaming of being the best DJ in the world. Unfortunately, he and his family and friends are all abducted by robot aliens, and he ends up having to learn a style of kung fu that is based on audio frequencies in order to save the world. Just like it sounds, I found it extremely fun and random, although it was a little too random, I thought, at times. Other than that, I can definitely see myself picking up Volume 2 whenever that comes out, and I gave this 4 stars. And the last thing that I got to in April was Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. This is a classic, or I guess modern classic, and it was mostly a reread for me. In high school, I had this thing with assigned reading where I would read like 75% of it and then never finish it. It was not effective, but I had enjoyed the 75% of this that I had read previously, so I thought it was probably time to give it a proper try, and I ended up really enjoying the other 25%. This is set around the time of the Buddha and follows a young man named Siddhartha who is following his own path to enlightenment, kind of like the Buddha but kind of not. Siddhartha really tries on quite a few different hats in his pursuit of enlightenment. He spends some time as an ascetic, just fasting and meditating. He spends a lot of time as a very rich merchant. And in the end, probably my favorite aspect of this book was the degree to which Siddhartha's mindset develops. Something I thought was really cool was that one of my favorite quotes from the beginning of the novel ends up being totally refuted by the end of the novel, just because his way of thinking has changed so much. Also, the translation that I read from the German was just very beautiful and very prosaic. I really just loved the writing style and thought that it suited the nature of the story very well. So my final verdict on Siddhartha was 4 stars, and that was where my reading ended this month. Overall, I feel okay about this month. A little disappointed here and there, but what can you really do? Feel free to let me know how your April went. I hope you're having a great day, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!